There's something about the silence out here on the farm that always unnerved me, especially when I'm alone. Maybe it's the vastness, the way the wind whistles through the trees, or the way the old wooden house creaks and groans as if it's alive. Joe, my brother, and his wife, Clara, had gone out of town for the weekend to visit Clara's parents. That left me alone to tend to the animals, the crops, and the house. I wasn't complaining. I liked the solitude sometimes, but there was always that underlying tension in the air, something you can't quite put your finger on. It was a chilly October evening, and the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters of the old farmhouse. I had just finished dinner and was settling in for the night when I heard it, a scream. It wasn't just any scream, though. It was a sound that made my blood run cold, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It came from somewhere deep in the cornfield, a long, drawn-out wail of pure terror, the kind that cuts through you and leaves you frozen. At first, I thought it might be a coyote, maybe even a prank by some local kids. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, and there was no mistaking it, a woman's scream, desperate and raw. My heart started racing, and every instinct in my body told me to stay inside, lock the doors, and wait for it to pass. But then I heard her voice, distant but unmistakable, pleading for help. I stood at the window, staring into the dark abyss of the cornfield. The tall, dry stalks swayed with the wind, and I could barely see beyond the first few rows. Every logical part of me said to stay put, but something else, something primal, compelled me to act. I grabbed Joe's old rifle from the closet, a beat-up thing he'd used for hunting over the years, and loaded around, just in case. My hands trembled as I opened the front door, stepping out into the cold night. The wind was harsher out here, carrying with it a scent of decay, the smell of the crops slowly dying with the season. I could still hear her, faint but there, calling for help from the cornfield. I took a deep breath and aimed the rifle towards the sky, firing a warning shot. The blast echoed through the empty fields, but the scream didn't stop. If anything, it grew more frantic, more desperate. "Who's out there?" I yelled, but my voice was swallowed by the night. No response. I ran back inside, my pulse pounding in my ears. I called 911, my voice shaky as I tried to explain what I'd heard. The dispatcher asked all the usual questions, how long ago, where I was located, and assured me that they'd send a squad car over. In the meantime, she told me to stay inside and lock the doors. It wasn't long before 2 officers arrived, their lights casting an eerie glow on the rows of corn. They searched the field, shining their flashlights into the thick stalks. I stood on the porch, watching, my gut churning. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. But after what felt like hours, they came back empty-handed. "Nothing out there," one of the officers said, wiping his brow. "Could have been an animal. Or maybe someone playing a prank. These old fields carry sounds strange sometimes." I nodded, but I didn't believe him. The scream had been too real, too human. "If you hear anything else, don't hesitate to call us back," the other officer said as they got into their car and drove off into the night. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. The house was quiet again, but that scream lingered in my mind, like an echo I couldn't shake. I paced the living room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it really just a prank? Or had someone really been out there, in trouble, and I hadn't done enough? As the hours passed, I started to convince myself that maybe the police were right. Maybe it was just a trick of the wind, or some animal in distress. But then, sometime after midnight, I heard something else, a soft creak from downstairs. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone, and Joe had made it clear that no one else should be around. I grabbed the shotgun we kept by the bed and slowly made my way downstairs, my feet barely making a sound on the old wooden steps. The house was dark, save for the faint moonlight streaming in through the windows. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw it, a tall, lanky figure, standing in the shadows by the front door. My blood turned to ice. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. "Who the hell are you?" I shouted, raising the shotgun. The figure didn't respond. I could barely make out its features in the dim light, but I could tell it wasn't right. Too tall, too thin, like something out of a nightmare. I took a step forward, and as soon as I did, the figure bolted for the door, flinging it open and disappearing into the night. I ran after it, but by the time I got outside, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness and the corn. I called the police again, breathless and panicked, and they came back out. Once more, they found nothing, no sign of forced entry, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had been inside. They assured me it was probably just my nerves, maybe even a trick of the light. But I knew what I saw. And I knew something, or someone, had been in my house. I didn't sleep that night, sitting in the living room with the shotgun across my lap, every creak of the house setting me on edge. I kept replaying the scream, the figure in the shadows, over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly, horribly wrong. Days passed, but the unease never left me. Joe and Clara came back, and I told them what had happened. Joe tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just a couple of kids messing around, but I could tell he didn't entirely believe that either. The scream, the figure in the house, it weighed on me, like a dark cloud that wouldn't lift. A few days later, Joe and I were out in the fields, finishing up the harvest. I'd almost managed to push the whole thing to the back of my mind when I saw something. It was barely visible at first, half buried in the dirt between the rows of corn. A shoe. Not just any shoe, a woman's shoe. I froze, staring at it, my heart hammering in my chest. All the memories from that night came flooding back in a rush. The shoe sat there, half buried in the soil like some forgotten relic. I stared at it, feeling the blood drain from my face. My breath caught in my throat as a wave of nausea swept over me. It was small, black, and worn, the kind of shoe someone might wear for a night out, certainly not something you'd expect to find in the middle of a cornfield. "Joe!" I called out, my voice hoarse. He was a few rows over, busy with the harvest, but when he heard the tone in my voice, he dropped what he was doing and hurried over. His brows furrowed when he saw me crouching by the shoe. "What is it?" he asked, wiping his hands on his jeans. I pointed at the ground, too stunned to speak. Joe followed my gaze and knelt down beside me, picking up the shoe with a puzzled expression. "The hell?" he muttered, turning it over in his hands. This wasn't here before, was it?" I shook my head. "No way. I've been through this part of the field a dozen times. This wasn't here." Joe stood up, brushing dirt off his hands, but I could tell he was just as unsettled as I was. His eyes flicked from the shoe to the rows of corn swaying in the breeze. For a moment, we both just stood there, staring at the empty fields around us, the silence between us heavy with unspoken fears. "You think it's connected?" Joe finally asked, his voice low. I didn't need to ask what he meant. The scream. The figure in the house. The eerie, unsettling feeling that had been hanging over the farm since that night. I nodded slowly, my mouth dry. There was no denying it now. Something had happened here, something terrible. "We need to call the police," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Joe hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I guess so. But what if it's just a coincidence? I mean, it's just a shoe." "It's not just a shoe, Joe," I snapped, frustration and fear bubbling up inside me. "You heard that scream. You know something's wrong. What if—" I trailed off, unable to finish the thought. What if someone had been out there that night, hurt or worse? What if we had missed the only chance to help them? Joe sighed and nodded, pulling out his phone. "All right, I'll call him." The police arrived about an hour later, the same officers from before. They didn't look too happy to be back, especially over something as seemingly trivial as a shoe, but they took it seriously enough. They bagged the shoe as evidence and asked us the usual questions, when we found it, if we'd seen anything strange in the past few days. I told them about the figure in the house again, but just like last time, they didn't find any signs of forced entry. No footprints, no broken locks. It was like whoever had been in the house had vanished without a trace. "I'm not saying it's impossible," one of the officers said, trying to sound reassuring. "But there haven't been any reports of a missing person in the area, and without more to go on, there's not much we can do." "So what are we supposed to do?" I asked, feeling helpless. "If you find anything else, anything at all, call us immediately. And if it'll make you feel better, we can have someone patrol the area for the next few nights." I nodded, but their words did little to comfort me. The shoe, the scream, the figure in the house, they haunted me. Even with the police patrolling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something, that something terrible had happened right under our noses. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made my heart race. I kept imagining that tall, thin figure standing at the bottom of the stairs, watching, waiting. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows at least 5 times, but it didn't help. Something was out there, and I could feel it, like an itch at the back of my mind that wouldn't go away. The next morning, Joe and I returned to the fields to finish the harvest. I tried to keep my mind on the work, but my eyes kept drifting to the rows of corn, half expecting to see someone or something lurking just out of sight. Every rustle of the wind through the stalks sent a shiver down my spine. It was late in the afternoon when I heard Joe's voice again, this time more urgent. "Hey, come here! You need to see this!" I dropped what I was doing and rushed over, my stomach already in knots. Joe was standing by the edge of the field, near the tree line, his face pale. "Look," he said, pointing at the ground. At first, I didn't see it, but as I looked closer, I realized what he was pointing at, a shallow indentation in the dirt. It looked like a footprint. Not just any footprint, though. It was too large, too deep, and the shape of it was wrong. It was elongated, almost like someone had been dragging their feet. "I don't like this," Joe muttered, shaking his head. "Not one bit." We followed the footprints, our hearts pounding in our chests. They led us deeper into the field, weaving between the rows of corn in a strange, erratic pattern. Every step we took felt heavier, like we were walking towards something we didn't want to find. The footprints led us to a clearing, where the corn had been trampled down into the dirt. And there, in the center of the clearing, was something that made my blood run cold. It was a patch of dried blood, smeared across the ground, mixed with bits of broken corn stalks and dirt. My knees went weak, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. "Oh God!" Joe whispered, his voice barely audible. We stood there in stunned silence, staring at the blood stain, either of us daring to move. It felt like the whole world had stopped, like we were standing on the edge of some dark, horrible secret. "We need to call the police," I said again, my voice shaky. Joe didn't argue this time. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his hands trembling. When the police arrived, they cordoned off the area and began searching the field more thoroughly. I watched them from a distance, my stomach in knots, praying they would find something, or maybe nothing at all. I didn't know what to hope for anymore. Hours passed, and as the sun began to set, one of the officers approached us. "We've found more footprints," he said, his face grim. "But they disappear near the tree line. And there's no body, no sign of anyone injured or missing. We'll have to run some tests on the blood, but for now, we don't have much to go on." "So what does that mean?" I asked, my voice hollow. "It means we'll keep investigating," he replied. "But for now, there's nothing more we can do." Joe and I watched as they packed up and left, leaving us standing in the field, the weight of the discovery hanging heavy in the air. The next few days passed in a blur. The police came and went, asking more questions, searching for clues, but nothing else turned up. No body, no missing person reports, nothing to explain the blood, the footprints, or the scream. The farm felt different after that. The once peaceful, quiet fields now felt ominous, haunted by whatever had happened that night. Every time I walked through the rows of corn, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whatever, or whoever, had been out there was still lurking, waiting. And the worst part was, I knew we would never truly know what had happened. We would never get the answers we needed. But the fear, the unease, that would never go away. Growing up, my brothers and I spent most of our summers at our family's vacation home in a little town called Hollywood, South Carolina. It wasn't anything fancy, just a mobile home on the edge of some farmland, surrounded by woods that seemed to stretch for miles. The kind of place where you could disappear into the quiet for hours. Our parents loved it for the peace and quiet, but for us, it was an endless playground. The fields, the woods, and the scattered old buildings made it feel like our own private world to explore. My brothers, Luca, the oldest, then me, Oren, and my two younger brothers, Jasper and Iver, would always spend our time outside, climbing trees, running through the woods, and making up games to pass the long summer days. Our favorite, though, was hide and seek. We'd pick one of us to be the seeker, and the rest would scatter like shadows across the property, hiding in all the nooks and crannies the land had to offer. But there was one place we always dared each other to explore, the abandoned house about half a mile from our home. It sat on the edge of a cornfield, a small, dilapidated building that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. No one ever talked about it, but something about that place made my skin crawl even in broad daylight. One summer afternoon, when the air was thick with the scent of crops and the buzzing of cicadas, we decided to play hide and seek near that house. We'd never gone that far from the mobile home before, but being kids, we didn't think twice about it. Luca was the seeker that day. As the oldest, he always played his part with more intensity, making everything feel like a real adventure. He started counting with his eyes closed, leaning against one of the old fence posts near the road. 1, 2, 3. Luca's voice drifted as the rest of us darted off. I ran straight for the cornfield, its tall, green stalks forming a perfect hiding place. The corn was thick and rustled with every step, and I felt safe there, knowing I could move around without being seen. I crouched down, catching my breath, and waited for Luca to come looking. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the field, but the thrill of the game kept my nerves in check. That's when I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps on the dry ground behind me. At first I thought it was Luca, so I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath. But something was off. The footsteps weren't hurried or deliberate like his would have been. They were slow, almost hesitant, like whoever, or whatever, was walking didn't want to be heard. I turned my head slowly, peeking between the stalks. All I saw was the endless maze of corn, waving gently in the breeze. But the sound continued, getting closer. My heart raced. Luca couldn't have found me so quickly, and I knew Iver and Jasper were hiding somewhere else. I decided to make a break for it, figuring I could run to the shed near the house and hide there instead. I bolted from the cornfield, my feet pounding against the dirt as I reached the small, weathered shed. I crouched down behind it, breathing hard, waiting for the footsteps to fade. But they didn't. They stopped. I glanced back toward the field, half expecting to see Luca grinning, ready to tag me. But he wasn't there. No one was. The corn rustled in the breeze, but the footsteps had stopped as soon as I left the field. It was like whatever had been following me disappeared the moment I stepped out. Something wasn't right. A few minutes later, I heard Luca shouting, "Got you!" as he found Jasper and Iver near the house. I came out of my hiding spot, still shaken by what I'd heard. We all regrouped, laughing and bickering about who had the best hiding spot. I kept my mouth shut about the footsteps. Maybe I was just imagining things. As we walked back home, the sky turning a dusky purple, I asked Luca if he'd been near the cornfield. "Nah, I stayed closer to the house," he said. "Why?" "No reason," I mumbled, not wanting to seem paranoid. That night, when we got back to the mobile home, Dad was sitting on the porch, smoking his usual after-dinner cigarette. We told him about our game, how we'd played near the abandoned house. He frowned. "No one's lived in that place for years," he said, almost as if he was talking to himself. A cold shiver ran down my spine. No one lived there? Then what, or who, had I heard in the cornfield? The rest of that evening was uneventful. We ate dinner, watched TV, and eventually crawled into our bunks, exhausted from the day. But as I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us. Something that wasn't one of my brothers. The next day, though, the weirdness of the previous evening was pushed aside by the thrill of another adventure. We decided we were going back to that old house, this time after dark. It was Luca's idea, of course. He was always the brave one, the leader who got us into all kinds of trouble. And being his younger brother, I wasn't about to back down. But Yver, the youngest, didn't want to come. He was only 8 at the time, and nights in the country can be pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallows everything whole. So, it was just the 3 of us, Luca, Jasper, and me, armed with flashlights, as we made our way through the woods toward the cornfield again. I could feel the tension between us. It wasn't just the excitement of playing in the dark, it was something more, something heavier. Maybe it was because we all knew, deep down, that there was something strange about that place. The night air was thick, the kind of stillness that amplifies every sound. We could hear our footsteps crunching on the gravel road as we walked back toward the abandoned house. I held my flashlight tightly, its beam cutting through the dark, revealing only more shadows ahead. Luca led the way, of course, with Jasper following close behind. As we neared the house, I hesitated. There was a feeling in the pit of my stomach that something wasn't right, but I couldn't place it. Luca stopped at the edge of the cornfield, grinning at me and Jasper. "All right, you guys ready for flashlight tag?" We nodded, but I could sense the unease in Jasper's expression. He glanced toward the dark rows of corn, the stalks swaying slightly in the night breeze. I tried to shake off my own nerves. It was just a game. Luca held up his flashlight, the beam flickering as he waved it toward the old house. "All right, I'll be the seeker this time," he said. His voice was steady, but I could tell he was just as keyed up as the rest of us. There was something about playing in the dark that made everything feel different, more dangerous, like the shadows themselves had grown teeth. "Count to 50, I said, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. Luca nodded, and without another word, Jasper and I ran off in different directions. I glanced over my shoulder as Luca pressed his hands to his face and started counting aloud. 1, 2, 3. I bolted for the cornfield. Something inside me told me it was a bad idea, but my legs carried me there anyway. The tall stalks loomed like silent sentinels, their leaves whispering in the breeze. Once I was deep enough inside, I crouched down, the soil damp beneath me. The darkness felt alive around me, the rows of corn creating a maze that twisted in every direction. The flashlight in my hand seemed weak, almost useless, as I turned it off to avoid being seen. The air smelled of earth and something else, something faintly metallic. I tried to focus on Luca's counting in the distance, but every little noise made me jump. The wind moved through the corn, a low rustle that sounded too much like footsteps. For a moment, I considered running back to the house, calling it quits. Maybe I could hide near the shed again, like the day before. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not Luca's, his would have been faster, more deliberate. These were slow, dragging almost, as if someone was moving cautiously through the field. My heart began to race, each beat pounding in my ears. I stayed perfectly still, hoping whatever it was would pass by without noticing me. But the footsteps kept getting closer. I slowly flicked on my flashlight, pointing it toward the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow path between the stalks. I scanned back and forth, expecting to see Luca's face pop out, grinning. But there was no one. The footsteps stopped as soon as my light hit the area. I held my breath, staring into the shadows. The quiet was oppressive, like the entire world was holding its breath with me. Then I saw it. A figure, just at the edge of my light's reach. It wasn't moving toward me, just standing there. I couldn't make out much, only that it was tall, a man maybe, but something about the way he stood made my skin crawl. His head tilted slightly, as if he were watching me. I stepped back, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Luca?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving. And then, in the silence, I heard a voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, but clear enough that it sent a chill down my spine. "Can I play with you guys?" I froze, the words hanging in the air, each syllable dripping with something dark and wrong. The figure took a step forward, just one, and I saw the flash of something pale in the light. A face, deformed, or maybe it was a mask. I couldn't tell. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing fast enough. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the game anymore. I didn't care about Luca or Jasper. I just ran as fast as I could, crashing through the corn, the stalks tearing at my skin as I bolted toward the house. I could hear footsteps behind me now, faster, louder, like the thing was chasing me. I didn't dare look back. Every part of me was focused on getting out of that field. When I burst out into the clearing, I nearly ran straight into Jasper, who was hiding near the old shed. "Oren, what the hell?" he started, but I grabbed his arm, yanking him toward the road. "We need to go," I gasped, barely able to form the words. "No." Jasper didn't argue. He must have seen the panic in my eyes, because he immediately dropped his flashlight and followed me. We ran back toward the mobile home, my legs burning with every step. Behind us, the cornfield was silent again, but I knew that thing, whatever it was still out there. We didn't stop until we reached the porch, both of us panting and out of breath. Luca arrived moments later, confused and irritated. "What the hell? I wasn't done counting!" I stared at him, my chest still heaving. "There was someone in the cornfield." Luca frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I saw him," I insisted. "He was just standing there. He asked if he could play with us." Luca's face went pale. "That's not funny, Oren." "I'm not joking," I snapped, my voice shaking. "I'm telling you, there was someone else out there." Jasper looked between us, his eyes wide with fear. "We shouldn't have gone back there." "I knew it." We hurried inside, locking the door behind us. When we told our parents what happened, they were confused at first, then concerned. My dad frowned, listening carefully as I described what I'd seen. But when I mentioned the voice, the way it whispered that awful question, his face darkened. He didn't say anything right away, just told us to stay inside for the rest of the night. The next morning, he was unusually quiet, but I noticed him and Mom having a hushed conversation. After that, they wouldn't let us go near the old house again. Dad even boarded up the back door, saying it was to keep the critters out. But I knew better. We never saw that figure again, but the memory haunted me for years. Eventually, we sold the vacation home, and I never went back to Hollywood, South Carolina. It was Darren's idea to head out to his family's rural property in Michigan. We'd been talking about getting away for a weekend, doing something a little adventurous but still within driving distance. Off-roading through the woods, camping under the stars, something simple. I hadn't been out there before, but Darren had spent a lot of summers at the place, so he knew the area well. The property was vast, bordered by thick woods on one side and endless fields on the other. Darren said it was quiet, really remote. Not much around except for a couple of abandoned barns and an old church that had been out of use for as long as he could remember. He'd mentioned the church offhand, like it was no big deal. In fact, the thought of exploring a forgotten, decaying church actually sounded intriguing to me. There's something about abandoned places that sparks curiosity. We packed light, a couple of bags with the usual supplies, some food, water, flashlights, and just enough beer to make the nights more fun. The drive out to the property was long and uneventful, the roads narrowing into dirt paths as we got deeper into the countryside. By the time we arrived, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the fields. It was beautiful, in that eerie, middle-of-nowhere kind of way. Darren's family owned a small cabin on the property. Nothing fancy, just one story with a couple of bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room with an old wood-burning stove. The kind of place that would feel cozy if you weren't aware of how far away it was from the next house. After unloading our stuff, Darren suggested we go out for a ride before it got completely dark. The trails were rough but manageable, and for the first hour or so, we had a blast. We tore through the forest, the sound of the ATV engines echoing off the trees. There was a thrill in the air, the kind you get when you're far from civilization with no one around to tell you what to do. Eventually, we found ourselves near the church Darren had mentioned. It sat at the edge of the woods, isolated and decaying, surrounded by waist-high weeds. The structure was old, very old. Its white paint had long since chipped away, leaving only traces of the color it once had. The steeple was crooked, and the windows were either broken or boarded up. Something about it made me uneasy, but I didn't want to show it. After all, I'd come here for adventure, right? "Let's check it out," Darren said, his voice filled with excitement. He grabbed his flashlight and gestured for me to follow. I hesitated, just for a second, but curiosity got the better of me. We parked the ATVs near the church, and as we approached, the place seemed even more foreboding. The silence was thick, the kind that makes the air feel heavy. The front doors were slightly ajar, creaking on their rusty hinges as Darren pushed one open. The inside was worse than I expected. Dust floated in the beam of our flashlights, and the pews were scattered as if something had ransacked the place. A musty, damp smell filled the air, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "Creepy as hell," I muttered. Darren chuckled. "Yeah, but it's kind of cool, right?" I wasn't so sure. There was something off about the church, something I couldn't put my finger on. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye, or the oppressive quiet that seemed to suffocate every sound we made. We walked deeper into the church, our footsteps echoing through the empty space. We stopped at the altar, where a tattered old Bible sat untouched, its pages yellowed with age. Darren was looking around, shining his flashlight into the corners, when something caught my eye. I turned toward one of the broken windows near the back of the church and froze. There, sitting in one of the pews, was a figure. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I focused, I saw it clearly, a person, or something that resembled a person, hunched over in the shadows. Its face was obscured, and its posture was unnatural, like it had been sitting there for years. "Darren," I whispered, my throat suddenly dry. He didn't hear me, too busy examining the Bible. I grabbed his arm and yanked him toward me. "Look!" He swung his flashlight in the direction I was pointing, and the beam landed directly on the figure. For a split second, neither of us moved. The thing didn't react to the light, it just sat there, unmoving. It was dressed in tattered clothes, its skin pale and gaunt. I couldn't see its face, but the way it was positioned, it didn't feel right. "Maybe it's a mannequin?" Darren said, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "I don't think so," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. Something about it felt too real. Too wrong. We both stood there for what felt like an eternity, unsure of what to do next. Then, without warning, the figure shifted. It didn't move like a person would, it was jerky, almost mechanical. And then, before either of us could react, it stood up. The light from our flashlights flickered for a moment, and in that brief second of darkness, the figure was gone. "Did you see that?" I gasped, stumbling backward. My heart was racing now, panic setting in. Yeah, let's get out of here," Darren muttered, his excitement from earlier completely gone. We didn't bother looking for the figure again. We bolted for the door, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we ran through the empty church. My stomach churned with fear, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run faster. We made it back to the ATVs, breathless and shaken. Neither of us spoke as we started the engines and tore out of there, the sound of the roaring motors doing little to ease the tension. As we rode back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the image of that figure, sitting in the church, waiting in the dark. What the hell was it? And why did it disappear like that? That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. Darren was quiet too, his usual carefree attitude completely gone. Something had happened in that church, something we couldn't explain. And deep down, I knew that whatever it wasn't over yet. I hardly slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes I saw the figure from the church, its pale, gaunt form shifting unnaturally in the shadows. The stillness of the cabin didn't help. It was as if the darkness outside was alive, pressing in on the windows, waiting for something. Every creak, every distant howl of wind made my heart race. Darren, usually the guy who slept like a rock, was up too. I could hear him shifting in his bed across the small cabin. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light broke through the trees, I felt a small sense of relief. The fear that had gripped me the night before didn't seem as overwhelming in the daylight. But there was still that lingering unease, like the shadow of a nightmare that refused to fade. "We need to check that place again," Darren said over breakfast, his voice unusually serious. He was staring out the window, his eyes distant. "There has to be some explanation. Maybe it was just a homeless guy or someone messing with us." I wanted to argue, to say that going back was a terrible idea, but part of me was just as curious as Darren. I needed to know what we had seen. I needed some kind of explanation to make the fear go away. So, later that afternoon, we geared up again, flashlights, a couple of beers for courage, and Darren even grabbed an old hunting knife his dad had left at the cabin. "Just in case," he said with a weak smile. We hopped on the ATVs and headed back toward the church. This time, the ride felt different. The excitement from the day before had been replaced with a heavy sense of dread. The church looked the same as it had the night before, silent, decaying, with its windows broken and doors hanging on by a thread. But in the daylight, it didn't seem as terrifying. It was just an old, abandoned building. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that what we saw last night was a trick of the light, maybe our own imaginations playing tricks on us after a couple of beers. But then we stepped inside. The musty smell hit me again, that same damp, rotting odor that had made me feel sick the night before. The sunlight streamed in through the broken windows, casting long shadows on the dusty floor. It was easier to see now, but that didn't make me feel any better. In fact, it made things worse. The figure was gone. "See? Probably nothing," Darren said, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He walked over to the pew where the figure had been sitting, shining his flashlight on the spot as if expecting to see some kind of clue. There was nothing, just dust and decay. But something didn't feel right. My stomach churned with that same sickening feeling from the night before. I scanned the room, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. And then I saw it, movement. Just a flicker at the edge of my vision, near the back of the church. "Darren," I whispered, but before I could finish, there was a loud crash. We both jumped, spinning toward the noise. The crash echoed through the old church, reverberating off the cracked walls and sending my pulse racing. Darren and I froze, hearts hammering in our chests. For a moment, neither of us moved, paralyzed by the sudden sound. It had come from the back of the church, near the boarded-up door that led to some long-forgotten room. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. Darren didn't answer right away. His face was pale, and his grip on the flashlight tightened until his knuckles went white. "Yeah, I heard it," he muttered, his eyes locked on the dark corner where the sound had come from. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the church was dead silent again, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. The stillness made the air feel heavier, pressing down on us, suffocating. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to run as far from this place as I could, but Darren took a step forward. "Maybe it's just some animal," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising tide of fear. "I don't think that was an animal, Darren. We should just go. Now." But Darren, being Darren, wasn't one to back down easily. He took another step toward the back of the church, shining his flashlight into the shadows. "Come on, we've come this far. Let's just check it out real quick, then we'll leave." I didn't want to follow him, but I also didn't want to be left standing alone in the middle of that cursed place. So, reluctantly, I stayed close behind him as we edged toward the back of the church. As we got closer, the stench of rot grew stronger. It was suffocating now, the smell thick in the air, making me gag. Darren pulled up the loose boards covering the door at the back, revealing a narrow hallway behind it, leading deeper into the building. The air inside was cold, unnaturally so, and my skin prickled as I followed him down the dark passage. The hallway led to a small room, barely big enough to be called a room at all. It looked like some kind of storage area. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and the walls were lined with old, decaying wooden shelves. Darren swept his flashlight around the room, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. "See? There's nothing here," he said, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. Just as I was about to agree and suggest we leave, something moved behind us. We both spun around, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the entrance to the hallway was the figure. It was the same thing we had seen the night before, pale, gaunt, its face obscured by the shadows. But now, in the dim light of the flashlight, I could see more details. Its clothes were torn and filthy, hanging loosely from its skeletal frame. And its eyes... God, its eyes were hollow, deep pits of darkness that seemed to pull the light out of the room. It didn't move like a normal person. Instead, it stood there, rigid, as if it were waiting for something. My heart stopped, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Then it lunged. "Run!" I screamed, pushing Darren out of the way. We bolted back down the narrow hallway, our flashlights bouncing wildly, the beam of light flickering as we stumbled through the darkness. Behind us, I could hear the figure's footsteps, slow and deliberate, like it knew we had nowhere to go. We burst out into the main hall of the church, sprinting toward the front doors. I could feel the thing behind us, closing in, its presence pressing against my back like a cold wind. Darren reached the door first, yanking it open with a loud creak. We tumbled outside, stumbling over the uneven ground as we ran toward the ATVs. "Go, go, go!" I shouted, practically leaping onto my ATV. Darren was right behind me, and within seconds, we were speeding down the trail, the engines roaring as we tore through the trees. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to know if it was still following us. The ride back to the cabin was a blur. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode, and my hands shook as I gripped the handlebars. Every shadow in the trees felt like it was watching us, waiting for us to slow down. But we didn't stop. Not until we reached the cabin. We skidded to a stop outside the front door, both of us panting and drenched in sweat. Darren looked at me, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was that?" he gasped, leaning against the cabin for support. I didn't have an answer. All I could do was shake my head, my mind still reeling from what we had just experienced. That thing, whatever it wasn't human. I didn't know how to explain it, but there was no doubt in my mind now. We had seen something unnatural, something wrong. "We're not going back there," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. "No way in hell," Darren agreed, his usual bravado completely gone. That night, we barricaded ourselves inside the cabin, locking every door and window, though deep down, we both knew it wouldn't matter if the thing decided to come for us. The hours dragged on, and sleep was impossible. Every noise outside, every gust of wind, every creak of the cabin, made me jump, convinced that it was coming for us. At dawn, we called Darren's dad. We didn't tell him everything, just that something strange had happened at the church and that we didn't feel safe. He was already on his way up to the property, so it didn't take him long to arrive. When he got there, we told him the whole story, about the figure, the noises, the chase. I could see the disbelief in his eyes, but there was also concern. He didn't brush us off or laugh it away like I expected him to. Instead, he said, "Let's go take a look." Despite everything, I felt a small sliver of relief. Maybe with him there, we'd get some answers. Maybe it was just some drifter, some lost soul who'd been hiding in the church. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. When we arrived at the church again, it was exactly as we'd left it, silent, decaying, and abandoned. Darren's dad walked through the building, checking every corner, every room. And then, just as he was about to call it quits, he froze, staring at something on the floor. There, in the dust, were footprints. They weren't ours. They led from the back of the church to the door, and then they stopped. Like the figure had vanished into thin air. Darren's dad looked at us, his face pale, the same fear we'd felt the night before creeping into his eyes. "We're leaving," he said quietly. "No." We never talked about the church after that. We didn't want to. Whatever we saw that night, it wasn't something that belonged in our world. And we weren't going to stick around to find out what it wanted. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls through the trees, I think about that figure. And I wonder if it's still there, sitting in that abandoned church, waiting for someone else to find it.